Kia ora tatou, tēnā koutou, nā mai haere mai. Kia ora Sam, kia ora whānau, nā mihi, nui kuia, koutou katoa. Welcome to Williams family members, Sam Carpenter, our guest speaker tonight. Keep the microphone up to my face as I'm reminded by Priscilla. Just a news flash that came in a little while ago that I ought to pass on. You know, of course, that one of the reasons that Henry Williams was moved to translate the treaty and also extol its virtues was his worry about a French invasion. And he wasn't keen on the Catholic religion or the French in particular. But we noticed tonight there's just been discovered in the Hauraki Gulf a French naval vessel that the authorities didn't know about. And here it is coinciding with the Williams reunion. I think there's I think there's a message here somewhere. Anyway, that's the weak joke for the evening. Anyway, for those of you who weren't present at Caroline's Fitzgerald's excellent talk earlier this afternoon, and also on the bus tours today, I'm John Andrews, who I'm a member of the Henry and William Williams Museum Trust, Memorial Museum Trust, and I've been embroiled in the history program for the reunion. After this, I'll probably never do it again. But anyway, no, it's been a real pleasure. But this is my last performance. Signatures will be taken. Anyway, it's my pleasure this evening to introduce Samuel Carpenter. I've known Sam for a number of years, and he's probably already known to some of you as one of the founders of the Karuwha Trust, many of whose members, and I think, have been volunteers at this reunion. So welcome to them if they're here tonight. And thank you very much for your helping us out. This is a charitable trust group that leads groups to Waitangi and other significant locations that relate to the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Sam is a graduate of Auckland University in Arts and Law and practiced law for several years in the illustrious firm of Chen and Palmer, who I think were the first public law firm to set up in New Zealand. Is that correct, Sam? Yeah, so pioneering stuff. Anyway, he completed an MA thesis in history and worked as an historian for the Waitangi Tribunal and the Office of Treaty Settlements, the Crown Law Office, and more recently, Te Arawhiti, which is the newly established Office for Crown Māori Relationships. He completed a PhD in 2021, exploring relationships and political community in the Maori and European worlds in the 19th century. And he teaches at Laidlaw College, which is a theological college researching and writing on early Christianity in New Zealand. I should also mention that Sam is engaged in writing a new biography of Henry Williams, and for many of those who've been interested in that story, we think it's now about time that we had a new one, so we'll be looking forward to that output. His talk tonight is has the Williams story shaped Christianity, culture, and nation in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and that's the title. And I'm welcome to Sam, and would you like to take the floor now? And he'll possibly take questions afterwards. So, thank you, Sam.
He honore, he kororia ki te atua, mo ngā rongo ki te whenua, whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Tiha wā mauri ora ki te wheao ki te ao marama. Ka nui te mihi ki te hau kāinga, ngā te rāhiri, me ngā te kawa, tēnā koutou katoa. I ngā uri o te whānau Wiramu, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. I ngā rangatira, I ngā minita, if there's any in the house, there probably are some, I suspect. I ngā pihopa, pia. I ngā pūkenga, I ngā hau e whā, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. So, I want to thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. I consider it a real privilege and honour to be addressing you on the occasion of this 200th anniversary as a significant family living in and contributing to this land of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I particularly want to acknowledge two people who, in my early years of discovering the Williams story, did much to inspire and support that interest. Carolyn Fitzgerald, I'm not sure if she's managed to make it. Oh, there you go. Carolyn's having a short break after her inspiring talk, I'm told. I'm afraid I wasn't able to get there. Her volumes of Henry and Mary Ann's letters have been invaluable for me, as I'm sure they've been for many researchers and family members. Elizabeth Ludbrook is the other person I want to especially mention. Is Elizabeth in? Oh, yes, okay. Oh, she's down the back there, hiding. Tēnā koe, Elizabeth. So when I knocked on the door of Elizabeth's Paihia bungalow in February 2000, she generously invited me and my two brothers inside, I think offered us a cup of tea, and told me, more importantly, told us the stories of her tūpuna, which was a moving experience for me at the time. So in some sense, this talk tonight reflects something of a personal odyssey over the last 20 years. My talk tonight is obviously ambitious, probably overly so, and I could also have asked how it's been shaped by Christianity and their engagement with Māori culture. Like a tuku weave, the lines of influence flow in both or in many directions. In fact, without being influenced by te ao Māori, they would not, I believe, have had the influence that they have had, that is to say, that you have had. So, tēnā koutou katoa. I begin with Christianity, which is a pretty good place to start in my view. I begin with the mission period and the church. How has the Williams family shaped Christianity in Aotearoa, New Zealand? Firstly, who were these people? If we go back to the beginning in terms of their Christianity, what shaped them? So, the Williams family were of Welsh ancestry and were nonconformists or dissenters from the Church of England. And I say this is important as to their theology, but also their characteristics as people. The two are somehow interlinked. So Henry's grandfather was a congregational minister. The Congregationalists were Puritans, descendants of those old dissent groups who believed that the English Reformation did not sufficiently reform or purify the church. In other words, it remained too Catholic, emphasising the sacraments and liturgy rather than Bible teaching, plain worship, and salvation by faith. That's what Puritan actually means originally. So the Williams and Coldham families were independent-minded. In part, I suggest reflecting that nonconformists had historically been both persecuted by and excluded from the Anglican state. Thomas Williams, Henry's father, obviously had strong ideas about English liberties. Monarchy, yes, but certainly not absolute monarchy. When the French Revolution had reached a new peak in late 1792, Thomas feared that he had, quote, been rather imprudent in uttering his democratic sentiments, and feared he had gone too far and might be reckoned a marked man, as John Marsh's journals record. So he was fearful of censure from the authorities at this time, right? That's what he was afraid of. That didn't happen, I don't believe. But it's tempting to see in this upbringing and sense of the English past and Henry's later references to the Treaty of Waitangi as a Magna Carta, a document of constitutional significance that would protect Māori rights. And what about personality? These Puritans were not puritanical in the Dickensian sense. Sure, they dressed like crows in black, as James Belich so gratuitously pointed out in Making Peoples. The women wore bonnets and full-length dresses. They had fixed ideas about domestic cleanliness and tidiness and hard work. In this, they demonstrated their essential Puritanism, for work and cleanliness were close to godliness. However, dressing in black does not mean they were boring. I can think of more than one famous sports team. The Williams family lived life to the full, and at least some of them had a sense of humour. They played cricket. Thomas Williams sang jolly and patriotic songs and imbibed strong drink with his mates while sailing out around the royal yacht at Spithead of an evening. They appreciated fine church music and classical music. Thomas and Mary Williams went on a jaunt from Gosport to see performances of Handel. These Puritans had meals with business associates at the local pub, while at home they had tea parties and musical recitals, and even played cards. Now, I can't quite imagine Henry and Mary Ann playing cards, but maybe I'm wrong. Someone can correct me on that later. In New Zealand, they occasionally enjoyed a private joke at the expense of some eminent person. Mary Ann, for example, wrote to Jane describing their nickname for one British Navy colonel during the 1845 Northern War as Colonel Despond, rather than Colonel Despard. What C.S. Lewis said, I like to quote C.S. Lewis from again, of the early Protestants is true of the evangelical dissenters. Whatever they were not sour, gloomy, or severe, primarily because of their personal experience of a salvation freely bestowed. They were not, says Lewis, too grim, but too glad. The dissenters were very much influenced by the evangelical awakening of the 18th century, which reinforced the heart religion and personal piety of the Puritan tradition. Evangelicals emphasised Scripture, the cross of Christ, salvation by faith or conversion, as it's sometimes known, and activism in spreading the gospel, together with social reform. Think William Wilberforce Clapham. They also very much believed in God's overruling providence in history, despite setbacks and the actions of ill-disposed people, to probably quote one of Henry's words. Of course, it was through the evangelical Anglican influence of Reverend Edward Marsh, a cousin, that Henry Williams came to consider missionary service for the CMS, because of course the Anglicans were also influenced by this evangelical revival. Not all nonconformists in the late 1700s were evangelicals, however. Mary Ann's Coldham's Presbyterians were apparently not in this mould. Hence, the first person whom Henry may have led to a personal faith in Christ was Mary Ann, shortly after their marriage. I was quite surprised to find this account. And I think a significant one, given their later missionary endeavours together. Mary Ann's letters are full of expressions of a personal, vibrant faith, as when she describes the baptism of Taiwhanga, the first rangatira Māori baptised in 1830. A wonderful quote I'm not going to read tonight. That is Taiwhanga. So this mention of Māori baptisms is a segue into speaking about the influence of these evangelical missionaries on Christianity in Aotearoa, New Zealand. There are several leading aspects, all of which I can spend little time on tonight because I want to reach further down the generations and into other societal spheres of influence. But we can note the following. First, Henry's leadership and focus on translation of scripture and prayer book, teaching and prayer, with William providing the linguistic expertise alongside him. Second, catechizing and baptizing, a lot of this. Henry alone had baptised well over 1,000 Māori by 1844 in the southern Bay of Islands area. Third, the teaching or the training and releasing of native catechists or teacher preachers. This last was very significant for the emerging Māori church. The great Ngāti Porou evangelist, Piripi Taumata Ākura, announced that he had been with Williams of the Four Eyes, Karuwha, at Paihia. William Williams, observing with wonder the progress of Christianity on the East Coast prior to his arrival with Jane in 1840, stated that the English missionaries, quote, literally stood still to see the salvation of God. He was referring here to the spontaneous response of Māori, including released slaves, to the Christian message. And Piripi Taumata Ākura was among this considerable group of self-directed evangelists amongst Tapu and iwi Māori. Te Hāhi Mihingari itself, the formal missionary church of the CMS, was increasingly a Māori church, led by Māori laity and over time by ordained leaders or clergy, as Hirini Kā has recently described. The Christianity that the Williams brothers and their spouses influenced was a Māori form of Christianity, ultimately, in which Māori were willing agents and actors. And before I leave the church, I want to briefly mention the role of Henry as a peacemaker. The gospel of peace with God and with enemies was a critically relevant message in the 1820s to 30s period, the so-called Muscat War period. It provided a way out of cycles of warfare. Christian forgiveness meant that utu was no longer necessary. And the fact that missionaries were on hand and ready to mediate provided a practical mechanism out of war. Henry was foremost among these mediators, often working with rangatira Māori, as Angela Ballara and others have described. Culture. From the influence on Christianity itself, I turn to the subject of culture. How did missionary Christianity interact with Māori tradition? And what about the Williams' contribution to the study of te reo Māori and in advancing Māori education? That's a whole talk in itself. Some of you may know this place. The church buildings that sprung up across New Zealand in the 1830s to 40s were the whare-style churches described by Richard Sund. Much larger than traditional whare, they were constructed with central po, while many had ko whai patterning on the heke, rafters, and tukutuku panels on the walls. A few even had carved panels or popo. The most prominent example being Manu Tuke in Tūranga, Gisborne. And when I walked into this church in early January 2000, it was a spiritual experience that is hard to put into words. It felt ancient, yet alive and peaceful. And I left a note in the visitor's book if anyone wants to check when they return, if the visitor's book is still there. This Manu Tuke building is in fact the fourth instantiation of this famous line of churches. It is dedicated to Toko Toru Tapu, the Holy Trinity. Now the second version was built during William Williams' time over a lengthy 14 years, 1849 to 63, although with quite a break in the middle. As Richard Sund describes, Europeans generally disliked the aesthetic of Māori carving, and evangelical Protestant missionaries had additional, stronger reasons for disliking carvings in places of worship because it was seen as idolatry. Nevertheless, Rongo Whakaata master carvers at Manu Tuke wanted to include whakairo in the Manu Tuke church. I love this story. So while Williams was away itinerating for a few weeks around his extensive parish, they quickly got into their work, perhaps considering that forgiveness was more achievable than permission. Quite a Christian sentiment, perhaps. Well, when Williams did return, he did object to the scheme of carving denoting human figures, okay, the traditional sort of carving style. However, fascinatingly, the Tohunga Whakairo reached a compromise arrangement with Williams, which involved the elaborately carved manaia panels of the second Manutuki church, which finally opened for worship in April 1863, and that's a representation of it on the left. Now, the exact meaning of the manaia pattern is debated, but it could denote a creature that is part man, part spirit, perhaps a supernatural being of some kind. To quote Nick Tupara of Whakata, the messenger between the earthly world of mortals and the domain of spirits. So a Christian at this point is inclined to think of angels. Given his strong evangelical credentials, it was surprising William Williams was comfortable with any carving, as missionary churches of that age were almost completely unadorned, like their Reformation-era English counterparts back home. Despite this, however, despite this conservatism, Williams could still sound upbeat about the prospective carving scheme at Manutuki, writing in 1849. I think this is a very significant quote, which I probably should have put on the screen. "Carved work has seldom been seen in the country," he writes, "except upon a small scale. Indeed, there are few tribes who know anything of the art." Which is an interesting statement in and of itself. "If our work therefore proceeds, we shall have a more elaborate piece of workmanship than has been attempted by the natives before. It is gratifying to see so much labour bestowed upon such an object," i.e. the church. So Māori Christianity, or Te Hāhi Mihingare, quickly became an indigenous production. The new beliefs in whare karakia were metaphorical and physical spaces in which Māori thought forms and culture were reoriented, renewed and re-articulated. The Māori church buildings are a prime example of this, and later examples were to carry on this process, including St. Faith's, or Hinemutu, and St. Mary's, Tiki Tiki. The Williams first four, Henry, Marianne, William, Jane, and their children, were not the primary authors of such cultural productions, although they sometimes were important overseers and supporters of the wider building work, including Samuel Williams at Rangiatea in Otaki. Tēnā koe, Rangi. And they had, of course, introduced the faith that was now expressed in these new ways, ways that reinforced cultural pride and maintained tribal mātauranga. Now, it's also fascinating to note what Māori scholars such as Hirani Mokomead have suggested, that the large monumental whare-style churches of the 1840s and 50s, the previous one, Manutuki, Rangiatea, and others, were the ancestors of the large-scale meeting houses that began to appear in the late 1800s. So in a funny way, the church has become a sort of an archetype of the meeting houses that are built later. And this connects our narrative with the Te Aotea-educated Apirana Ngāta's program of arts and carving to reinvigorate Māori cultural pride in the 20th century. However, before we get on to ngata, let us firstly address Te Reo Māori and education. The Williams story is inextricably linked with the study of the Indigenous language and with Māori education. The story begins, of course, in the 1820s, when serious translation of the scriptures and the Book of Common Prayer commenced. With William Williams arriving in 1826, this language learning and translation work entered a new phase. With other gifted linguists, William translated the New Testament, and it was printed by Colenso in 1836 to 37 at the Paihia Mission Press in a run of 5,000 copies. Quite a feat in and of itself. From there, our story, or my story tonight, moves to the dictionary, whose name has become synonymous with Te Reo Māori, Williams, A Dictionary of the Māori Language, or New Zealand language as it was first known. First edition 1844, second edition 1852. Then the second generation takes over. Leonard Williams was baptised at Paihia in August 1829, along with the children of Rawiri and Mata Taifanga, the first rangatira baptisms. I showed Rawiri, or a drawing of him earlier. So Leonard produces the third edition of the dictionary in 1871 and the fourth edition in 1892. The whakapapa continues, and William Leonard's son, Herbert Williams, produces the fifth edition in 1917, reprinted twice. The sixth edition appears in 1957 and the current, I think it's still current, seventh edition, 1971. Now the sixth edition broke with tradition, being a revision or rather expansion produced by a committee of eminent scholars including Sir Apirana Ngata and Pei Tahuri Nui Jones. And it's not irrelevant to mention that Apirana Ngata was inspired to revise the dictionary while he was working on the revision of the Māori Bible some years previously. As J.M. McEwen wrote in the 6th edition preface, the whakapapa of 3 generations of Williams editing the dictionary is a most unusual family record. But it was, of course, an unusual family. By which he means, I think, unusually prolific rather than peculiar or strange. But it is a pity, McEwen went on, that the traditional family association with the dictionary has been broken, but it remains Williams' dictionary and will so remain as long as the Māori language is remembered. Now, McEwen's phraseology here and his reference to dying language, even though that's definitely not what the committee wanted or was working for, perhaps reflects a wider context in which Māori language use was fighting upstream against a tide of English and urbanisation rushing downstream. But the fact of the Williams Dictionary provided a storehouse of memory about the language and its use that was a tool ready to be deployed in the new era of Māori language recovery. One illustration of its importance through the 1970s to 90s period is that by the time I purchased my copy of the 7th edition at Auckland University in 1999, I inscribed it, it has gone through 8 reprintings. It had 8 reprintings by that time, so. Williams' Dictionary is still the gold standard in terms of a learned pātaka of kupu, their meanings and derivations. In 1968, Bruce Biggs, some of you may recognise that name, Auckland University Māori scholar, was laudatory about the linguistic genius of William Leonard Williams and the scholarly value of Herbert Williams' articles on the language. Biggs was less laudatory about the educational policy of the settler state in New Zealand, which had, he said, declared total war on Te Reo Māori. From the 1867 Education Act onwards, all state-sponsored schools adopted English language only instruction, as far as practicable was the expression. This policy also, was foisted also upon the mihingari or church schools, which until that time had pursued a bilingual educational approach, or rather, instruction was mostly in Māori, but English was taught as a second language. Even after 1867, however, the wider curriculum of these schools still employed Māori, especially as a language of scripture, obviously, and himine in church services. As the 19th century wore on, the needs of educating at secondary school level for higher education conducted in English became paramount. And into this picture comes the church secondary schools, of which the notable leaders were Te Aute and St. Stephen's, and their female counterparts, Queen Victoria and Hukariri. The male versions in particular, at that time, or in the early period, aimed to be centres of academic excellence, where aspiring and talented boys could take the matriculation exams, which were in English only, and enter university. But the sense that these Māori scholars were disadvantaged, is still reflected in a Te Aotea School report I promised my wife that I would try not to get emotional, hold it together. So that's one of my main aims tonight, is to hold it together. Still reflected in a Te Aotea School report prepared by the ageing Archdeacon Samuel Williams in 1904, in which English is still referred to as a foreign language, as in Samuel is calling it a foreign language. So, Reverend Samuel Williams of Te Aotea must be mentioned a little more. He was Henry and Mary Ann's third child, a second generation missionary of the CMS, a farmer and an educator. Southern Hawke's Bay chiefs and George Grey gave the land for Te Aotea in the mid-1850s. A school was opened until 1859 when war threatened and the economics became marginal. And sufficient government support for the enterprise did not continue. So, Samuel, putting to work his farming and administrative knowledge learned on the Pakaraka farm, inland Bay of Islands, ground out an agricultural empire of sheep and cattle, beginning with the fern and swampland around Te Aotea College. Those are my words, agricultural empire of sheep. This agricultural empire and the income from it in turn funded the school, which reopened in the early 1870s. In the early 1900s, Samuel Williams was still donating significant sums of money to both Te Aotea and Hokariri, and he passed away in 1907. Might just take a swig of water before I get onto the nation. So, from the realm of culture and education, I turn to the Williams' influence on the nation. The name of a certain Te Aotea scholar appears in one of Samuel Williams' school reports for the period 1889 to 1891. Apirana Turupa was listed first of 3 matriculation passes from Te Aotea College, with an average across English, arithmetic, algebra, Euclid, history, chemistry, and Latin of 91.8%, which is why he was top or near top of his class at university as well. And remember, this English is a foreign language, right? This is what Samuel was talking about later. The scholar highlighted was, of course, Apirana Ngata, later Sir. Following his Te Aotea education and his completion of a law degree, the first Māori to complete any university degree, Ngata entered upon a stellar parliamentary and governmental career, combining this with advocacy of Māori arts and traditional knowledge. Before he reached Parliament, however, he led a movement of social reform amongst Māori communities that became synonymous with the Young Māori Party. It was originally, though, the Te Aotea College Old Boys Association. Samuel Williams, in the same school report, where he reports Apirana's matriculation pass, mentions the stirring of this movement in 1891. So its reform agenda could be critiqued perhaps as reflecting a certain strain of evangelical or late Victorian morality. But at the heart of it was a vision to uplift the health, social and economic status of the Māori people. And who was amongst one of the first sponsors of this movement? Sam Williams of Te Aotea. Sybil Woods recounts how the Venerable Samuel Williams would turn up at Young Māori Party conferences and amaze all with his whai kōrero. And all this contribution was possible because of the upbringing he had on the Paihia mission and at the Pakaraka farm, and it was ultimately due, very much due, in this case, to his Christian convictions. So Samuel Williams was an infant when he arrived with Mother Mary Ann on the Paihia Beach in 1823. I'm not sure if you had an infant for your... Oh, you did? Oh, there you go. Tika. Like his siblings, he was a native speaker of Te Reo Māori. He grew up with it. Henry Williams writes a lovely account of his children back to England in the early years, and I'm grateful to Carolyn for including this in her letters from the Bay of Islands, because it captures the value placed upon the children's lives and their individual giftings, and upon the Māori language. And it also shows that Henry, although quite reserved in his exterior, was affectionate towards his children. I have got this quote. The little ones speak the language, the Māori language, nearly as well as their own. And Edward, who's 8 by this time, can talk to the natives a great deal better than I can. Mary Ann, second child, grows in stature and is acquiring some little stability, but she requires great attention. She is a dear little creature and fond of reading and learning. Samuel is a little, thin fellow, the same Samuel we've been talking about, and curious in many respects, and in great need of attention. I'm not quite sure what that means, but... Henry is a stout, sturdy little fellow, lively and the pet of most. He is learning his letters, but much more fond of play. Thomas is equal to the others in value, but can only just run about. He is attracting notice and can say a few words. We may learn the language so as to converse with the natives, but they will thoroughly understand it. And we hope by the grace of the Lord to see them engaged in his work. While most of the children were to become intimately involved in a missionary calling of some kind, and none more so perhaps than Sam Williams, but several other children made prominent contributions to public life and to the church. I'll just mention a few, because this is quite a long list. Catherine, Kate, became the wife of Octavius Hadfield. Samuel's wife was cousin Mary, the daughter of William and Jane. I hope I'm getting this whakapapa right. Henry Jr. Became a legislative councillor, marrying his cousin Jane, sister to Mary. Edward, the eldest, became a resident magistrate and native land court judge, and of course assisted with translation of the Treaty of Waitangi, which I'll get to in a moment. One child is not mentioned as much, Thomas, who, in 1826, Henry describes as equal to the others in value but can only just run about. While Thomas Coldham was to show himself equal in many respects to his other siblings, as a farmer and a businessman, as a supporter of Māori farming enterprise, and as someone who took a stand on matters of public moment. Like brothers and cousins, he also benefited from William Williams' tuition in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and mathematics at Tūranga, before studying for a time at Selwyn's St. John's College. So who was this Thomas Coldham? TC. Named after his paternal grandfather Thomas, apparently, and his mother's name, family name, Coldham. He seems to have inherited the propensity of both streams of whakapapa for feisty engagement in public affairs. One example will suffice. By the late 1850s, the Wellington provincial government began espying the land to the north of the Manawatu River, and this became known as the Rangitike Manawatu Block. All that land between the two great rivers running from the coast to the inner reaches of inland Pātea or Mokai Pātea towards the central spine of the Ruahine Ranges, 250,000 acres. That's how much land we're talking about here. The problem was that there were many hapu living there, most of them affiliated to Ngāti Raukawa, who had migrated to the Kapiti coast and into the territory of Ngāti Apa and other groups in the 1820s to 30s. Here's the hitch, or one of them, that Ngāti Raukawa, allies of Ngāti Toa, had by most accounts overcome the local tribes, but in some cases had extended protection to them. And I realise this story is very complex from a customary history point of view, and so I don't want to pretend that my summary is the definitive summary. I just add that caveat. One of the leaders of this benign conquest, as it was sometimes called at the time, was the eminent rangatira Te Whatanui. Problem was, and here's hitch two, the Wellington provincial government, under the leadership at that time of the bearded gentleman, Dr. Isaac Featherston, Dr. Featherston, I presume, had decided in its wisdom, or possibly avarice, to negotiate for the purchase of the land with the depleted portion of the original tribes, avoiding Ngāti Raukawa. Now, in Māori law or tikanga, as conventionally interpreted, the land was now under the jurisdiction of Ngāti Raukawa and its affiliate Hapu. And under the Crown's 1840 rule, as it became known, its obligations, or the Crown's obligations, were primarily to those who possessed the land as at 1840. The Crown turned up and said, well, whatever the situation is now is what we have to, honour or recognise, not what's gone on before that, even if it was in the very recent past. But the provincial government had now gone and done a deal with these other groups, avoiding the dominant Raukawa ki te Tonga. The government's hope was that, as in other scenarios, Ngāti Raukawa would come around and they could be paid for their interest in the land, leaving the Crown and the European settlers free rein. But Ngāti Raukawa Hapu had been living there since the 1830s at least, for 30 years or more. They had established homes and gardens and livelihoods, so they did not want to move. So what happens next? Well, the Crown carried on with its purchase. So Ngāti Raukawa took them to the Native Land Court in the mid-1860s. Enter T.C. Williams. T.C. was no lawyer, but he thought he saw an injustice. He wrote letters to local newspapers denouncing Dr. Featherston's provincial administration for this purported purchase in no uncertain terms. And it's interesting how he does this. He bases much of his argument on the Treaty of Waitangi. The title of his 1868 pamphlet was The Manawatu Purchase Completed, or the Treaty of Waitangi Broken. Then, although he was not a lawyer himself, TC becomes counsel for Ngāti Raukawa in the Native Land Court. So Ngāti Raukawa is effectively seeking to challenge the Crown's purchase by saying, we're actually the owners here. I mean, we're the dominant group here, at least. Even though these other hapu are still occupying parts of the land. So T.C. Williams was up against it because arrayed on the other side as lawyer for the Wellington provincial government was none other than the lawyer, former government minister and parliamentary brawler, William Fox. He did not pull his punches, and in keeping with the sometimes ferociously personal nature of local politics and court dramas, took Williams to task for his lack of legal acumen. The court held in 1868 that Ngāti Raukawa had only occupation interests in the block, not full ownership according to tikanga, which meant that they shared the block with these other original iwi. The end result, though, was that Ngāti Raukawa, who were the most numerous in the block, and I don't think that's disputed, were awarded only a minority of interests. That was the result. In effect, it was the Wellington provincial government which came off best. Richard Boast, a prominent legal historian, has studied this contest closely. He points out that this case was really the Anglican Church versus settler interests in Wellington. And this is fascinating. So Ngāti Raukawa witnesses included the Reverend Octavius Hadfield, the Reverend Samuel Williams, who had lived there for some years, many years, was an influential figure at the time, before he went to Hawke's Bay, and two Māori clergy, Rawiri Te Whānui and Hinari Te Hiriko. So these were witnesses for Ngāti Raukawa in the Native Land Court. The case lasted for 40 sitting days. TC, over the objections of Fox, gave his opening and closing submissions in fluent Te Reo Māori. This is Richard Boast's summation of the two parties' positioning. Fox, as a prominent settler politician, had no liking for the Church Missionary Society or the Treaty of Waitangi. Indeed, the two were linked together in his mind, seemingly. This is Boast. The Crown case was very well resourced, and Fox made a number of attacks on the Treaty of Waitangi in submissions. William's understanding of the treaty was a simple and straightforward one. It meant what it said, especially when it said that the chiefs and tribes were guaranteed possession of their lands, i.e., whatever lands they happened to have as at the time of the treaty. That's the 1840 rule. I think we need to hear this story because it is another example of the Williams family identifying with Māori interests and Te Tiriti o Waitangi in the face of injustices being committed by the settler state. T.C. Williams further identified with Māori by signing off his 1868 pamphlet as a native of New Zealand. This was no doubt provocative for settler consciousness, I suggest, at the time, but no less genuine in his case. The Anglican court and public relations campaign might have failed at this time. But to paraphrase an inspirational quote, the arc of history bends towards justice. Ngāti Raukawa claims are currently being heard by the Waitangi Tribunal, and it's my hope, certainly, that a restorative treaty settlement awaits. Te Tiriti. Henry Williams, don't worry, this is the 2-minute version. Henry Williams was given less than 24 hours to translate the English draft of the treaty, prepared by Captain Hobson and James Busby, primarily, into a text that Māori leaders at Waitangi and other locations would understand. That was the attempt, anyway. I'm not going to enter into the complexities of this debate, but perhaps I might be permitted to delineate my own understanding of what Henry and Edward were doing. The treaty, as Ned Fletcher's scholarship has recently affirmed, was about establishing government primarily over British settlers, with tribal government and custom continuing after 1840. The only exceptions to this were inhumane custom, as the British called it, and intertribal warfare. Hobson was also to regulate the trade in land, which is probably about the most important thing at the immediate moment, and probably would concern himself with serious crimes that involved settlers and Māori. All of these aspects were in some way comprised in Hobson's instructions from England. Of course, Henry did not see the instructions. He only had the English draft text which Hobson provided, although it's possible there was some little conversation over the text. It spoke of a cession of sovereignty to enable civil government to be established by Queen Victoria's governor. Henry and Edward chose the word kāwanatanga, or government, governorship, to express this. They avoided terms like mana or rangatiratanga, probably deliberately. One reason this was deliberate is that the missionaries believed, certainly hoped, that Crown authority would preserve Māori control of their lands and livelihoods. The treaty was not intended to remove such chiefly or tribal control, rangatiratanga or mana. This protective aspect of the Crown's intent was expressed exactly this way in Article 2. Therefore, the translation chosen for sovereignty, government, was a practical way of expressing the kind of authority the governor intended to exercise. The emphasis was on creating the basis for civil order. Now, putting aside debates in the literature about the exact meaning or intent of the treaty, the end result, was that the Māori text produced by Henry and Edward was signed by over 500 rangatira around the country. It has served as the basis for many kinds of political and legal debates over the decades. It has been a beacon of light in dark places. Considering its place in our national conversation today, even if contested, Henry's words seem prophetic in speaking of this treaty. Though severely tested, it has never yet been disturbed, notwithstanding that many in power have endeavoured to do so. he also stated, right in the middle of the 1840s, "I am satisfied the British government can never allow its violation." I'm approaching the end. Land, whenua. This is where I'm going to sort of land tonight. Anyway. No pun intended. And speaking of the Williams' impact on an emerging nation, I have to mention land, namely the land on this side of the Waitangi River, the treaty grounds, and that on the other side, Te Tii, or the Lower Marae. Now, the story of Governor-General Bledisloe acquiring the former Busby estate in the 1930s and gifting it to the nation is now widely appreciated. What is hardly ever mentioned, and I note, it's not really a criticism, but I note, currently almost hides, as part of the Bledisloe story, in a little nook of the impressive permanent exhibition at Waitangi, is the part played by Vernon Reid, MP. Now, Vernon was married to Isla Mabel Williams, a daughter of T.C., and thus Henry and Mary Ann's granddaughter. And Vernon was MP for Bay of Islands for many years, lived at Paihia with Isla, and from the early years of the 1900s attempted to interest the government in acquiring the Waitangi land as a national memorial. So he was trying to do this from the very early 1900s. What was the response? Some interest, but limited political will to make it happen. So, fascinatingly enough, it took a Governor-General sent out from England to achieve this vision. So on a day apparently divinely appointed in 1932, Vernon Reid arranged to ferry Lord and Lady Bledisloe across the mouth of the Waitangi River in what is described as a small yellow painted outboard skiff of doubtful seaworthiness. And his son, Nigel, operated the outboard motor. The Bledisloe party walked over the property and on their return visited Vernon at Paihia, where they announced their intention to acquire and then gift the property to the nation. The rest, they say, is history. Sir Apirana Ngata, too, was quick to seize this opportunity for a piece of nation building, literally. The whare whakairo and the large centennial commemorations followed in 1940. I should also mention a gentleman by the name of Kenneth S. Williams, a grandchild of both Henry Williams and James Busby, who, along with Ngata and Reid, were members of the first Waitangi Trust Board. Vernon Reid was also, another fascinating connection, one of 3 members of the Sim Commission, which was appointed in 1926 to investigate the 1860s raupatu, which they did do, and made recommendation. Possibly even less appreciated than the Williams connection to the Bledisloe gift story. Oh, sorry, I didn't. The 2 gentlemen, so back row, you probably can't read the bottom. Back row is Kenneth Williams and then Vernon Reid, second and third from left. Yes. Possibly even less appreciated than the Williams connection to the Bledisloe gift is the story of the Te Tii land. And time does not permit tonight to tell a full narrative of this, but I did speak of this previously in my 2014 talk at Paihia, which is available online at nzhistorian.com. That's my website. So, essentially, Henry acquired most of the coastal land. To summarise, Henry acquired most of the coastal land from Opua through to Waitangi for the CMS over the years of the 1820s to 30s. Only a portion of this was granted to the church by the Crown in the 1940s land commissions. In 1839, however, when land speculators were pressing, and there's a lot going on, Henry gifted the Te Tii Waitangi land back to the local hapu a Ngāti Rahiri through a leading rangatira Te Kimera on the basis that it would be a permanent reserve and so they could be close to the Paihia Church. Now, the history of this trust transaction only came to light in the early 1890s, some 50 years later, when Henry's sons supported the hapu claim in the Native Land Court for an award of title to this block. By his sons, I mean John, Edward and Henry Jr., who of course all resident in the area still at that time. A little side note here, the lawyer that was assisting them in the Native Land Court was John Reid, solicitor of Kawakawa, who was the elder brother of Vernon Reid. So there's connections everywhere. What is now the Marae block was granted title at that time, around 80 acres or so, and in the 1920s, under the sympathetic Judge Atchison, the remainder of the Te block, some 700 acres in total, was awarded title. So, if it were not for the Williams influence here, it is possible that the Crown would have taken the land as surplus. Such a claim was made prior to the 1890 hearings for this land, and it would now be bristling with hotels. Counterfactual, but possible. This history, which intimately connects the CMS mission and Williams land to, which intimately connects the CMS mission and Williams family to this land, is of course remembered by the hapu through the carving of Henry Williams' karuwha in the Te Waitangi Meeting House. So in summing up, this historian is tempted to postulate various counterfactuals. If it were not for Vernon Reid, would the Bledisloe gift have happened? If not for the 1839 retransfer of land by Henry, would the Lower Marae exist today? If it were not for the Māori text of Te Tiriti o Waitangi, I'll leave you to fill in that blank. In summing up, I asked, what is this Williams story really all about? Or mostly about? And I realised that different narratives can be constructed, and I've merely isolated a few of these stories from the first 2 or 3 generations of the family. But I think these narratives are foundational for the nation that Aotearoa New Zealand is, and is still becoming. So I want to end by characterising in a slightly different way these 3 features of Christianity, culture and nation, as shaped by the Williams family and their many friends, both Māori and Pākehā, shaped together in the making of Aotearoa New Zealand. Firstly, love, Christianity. Henry and Marianne Williams, William and Jane Williams, their families and their missionary friends came here to this land to serve God and their fellow creatures. This lovely English word, creatures, has an earthiness, a human resonance. Their mission was spiritual, but it was very much a material one too, concerned for the welfare of human beings in society. So love is the foundation of the 2 other building blocks. Second, identity, or culture. Christianity was never just about spiritual salvation. It was about rebirthing a new humanity with a human or cultural identity still linked with the past. Now, this statement may somewhat update the mission theology or missiology of the evangelical Anglican missionaries, such as the Williams, and yet it's not far off a description of what they were trying to achieve. They may not have had a sophisticated theology of language as a gift from God, but they understood implicitly that language was unique to this people, New Zealanders or Māori, and that the truths of salvation from the Holy Scriptures could only be communicated in that heart language. Literacy was a new source of knowledge which reshaped culture or identity, but did not erase the lineaments of Indigenous society. Third, Te Tiriti, or nation. This treaty stood for civil order, the exercise of control over lands and taonga, and equality of citizenship in a new type of society. Kāwanatanga, rangatiratanga and rights. Or a more modern version of that, partnership, protection and participation, which I think is actually a weaker version than the original, in my view. Te tiriti o Waitangi has come to be a distinctive marking, a moko perhaps, upon the face of our country. In 1840 it carried the hopes of Māori and humanitarian inclined folk for justice, and it still holds out hope for justice and reconciliation of all those who call Aotearoa New Zealand their home. Without the translation by Henry and Edward Williams, it would not be the document it has become or is becoming for this nation. He wai anō, ka mutu taku kōrero, engari kai o wariwari I wēnei kōrero I ngā wā ki te hiki mai. And so my talk has now concluded for the minute, and let these stories never be forgotten in the times ahead. Nei rā te mihi aroha kia koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou, kia ora mā tātou. Were apparently not in this mould. Hence, the first person whom Henry may have led to a personal faith in Christ was Mary Ann, shortly after their marriage. I was quite surprised to find this account. And I can spend little time on tonight because I want to reach further down the generations and into other societal spheres of influence. But we can note the following. First, Henry's leadership and focus on translation of scripture and prayer book, teaching and prayer, with William providing the linguistic expertise alongside him. Second, catechising and baptising, a lot of this. Henry alone had baptised well over 1,000 Māori by 1844 in the southern Bay of Islands area. Third, this last was very significant for the emerging Māori church. The great Ngāti Porou evangelist, Piripi Taumata Ākura, announced that he had been with Williams of the Four Eyes, Karu Whā. Te Hāhi Mihingari itself, the formal missionary church of the CMS, was increasingly a Māori church, led by Māori laity and over time by ordained leaders or clergy.